Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is our weekly teaching for July the 2nd. This is Saturday, and last week, let's see, this is number 35. Last week, I spoke with you about the book that I just finished and published called Finding Faith, the Historical Jesus and the Undisputed Paulines. And I feel a little sheepish saying publish the book because that makes you think of, something like this, physical like that. But of course it was digitally published, meaning you could see it on a tablet device like this. But that way I can, I've got the means to publish it myself and make it accessible to people, available to people, and without having to involve a publisher. And when I was praying about what I should speak about this week, it occurred to me that maybe it'd be useful for me to talk about one of the other books that I've digitally published. Specifically, I'm talking about The Biblical Case for Everyone is Going to Heaven. And what I want to do is give you just a personal view or some personal background on how that book came to be, because when someone sees a book title like that, and the original book title, and I'll explain that in a minute when I say original, what I mean by that. The original book title was simply Everyone is Going to Heaven. And when I digitally published it, or in its more recent form, it's been called The Biblical Case for Everyone Going to Heaven. And my idea with book titles is to try to reflect as accurately what the content of the book is, and to really condense the message into the book, into the title, so that if you read the title and then read the book, you would basically feel like, well, everything I read, the book was what the title presented itself to be. So it's almost as if I'm writing a newspaper story where, if you remember in school, they taught us that the whole story should be encapsulated in the headline, and then you've got the whole story laid out in the article. So I originally wrote the book in 1993, which is hard for me to think about, but that's like 23 years ago. See, 93, 03, 13, 16, yeah. So 23 years ago. It doesn't seem like that long ago. But the idea first came to me in 1982. And again, I'm giving you this background because when you see a book title like that, you think, well, what would make a person write a book like that? I mean, people would react to it different ways, I think, depending on what their background is. But I was an evangelical Christian, and which I still consider myself to be, although a lot of evangelical Christians wouldn't consider me one anymore. But sometimes I think I don't want to identify as any of those names. I just want to be associated with Jesus Christ and let people call me what they want to. But it's His name I want to be associated with. It's not a function of what my name is or my identity is or title is. It's a function of who He is and who I am to Him, and who you are to Him, who everyone is to Him. And that's a part of this whole reorientation of our lives that He wants to bring about, reorienting ourselves around Him, which should not be considered an unnatural thing because He's our Creator. Well, at any rate, just giving you some of this personal backdrop, in 1982, I was preaching. And I was preaching at a particular church in St. Louis, and it was called New Testament Christian Church. It was a non-denominational church. And every Sunday I would preach. I wasn't the pastor there. I would later become the pastor, but at this time I was just, I think what some people call pulpit supply. I was preaching there. I had been the youth pastor or the youth minister at a Presbyterian church. But I won't go into all that right now for today, because that would just take us too far afield. But I had been through a period of intense Bible study. And for me, intense Bible study means I take the Bible, whichever one I'm working with at the time. In 1982, it wasn't this one. But it was a Bible like this. It was a New American Standard Bible. And I study it. I read it. I make notes. I use a concordance, and just study the scriptures, and then let them say to me, let God speak to me through them, and then those out of that would come whatever understanding I would gain of God and His ways, and that's from there would come the subjects that I would preach on. And so this had been a period of several weeks where I was really able to sort of push away all other activities and focus on the Bible, not reading books about the Bible, not reading commentaries, but just reading the Bible itself. And so when that happens, I have a great deal of peace, and my thoughts are just sort of like Bible verse after Bible verse. I mean, I would memorize parts of the Bible, and just my thoughts became enriched by all this Bible study. And I remember I was making copies of cassette tapes. Back then, cassette tapes were the big thing. That's how you got teaching shared. And so I would preach on Sunday, and then during the week, I would find occasion to go back to the church. It was about 30 minutes away from where we lived. And I would go back, and they had recorded the sermon on a cassette, but they had no way to duplicate the cassettes. And a friend of mine worked at a big Presbyterian church downtown, and he would let me use their tape duplicator machine. You could take a cassette tape and put it in one part, and then put like 3 blank ones in there and run it, and in a matter of 5 minutes you could reproduce a tape, a 30-minute tape or a 45-minute tape, however long the sermon was, and do it as many times as you needed to produce the cassettes. And then people would purchase the cassettes who couldn't be to hear the sermon, or who wanted to hear it again, who wanted to hear the teaching. So I was making those copies. I was driving from this church, which is also 30 minutes from the church I had to go to make the copies. And so I had a lot of time just to think and to meditate the scriptures. I'm not playing the radio or anything like that. I'm just meditating on the Word of God. And I can't go back through everything that was in my mind. I can't even recall everything that was in my mind. But it was just picture several days or weeks of really focusing in on God and meditating on His Word, trying to learn His ways, trying to cultivate a listening heart. And all of a sudden, in my heart, this awareness, I can't remember exact words or exactly how the thought was framed, but it was like all of a sudden, it was like I knew everyone was going to heaven. It was like God was saying that to me. And as an evangelical Christian who just some 4 years before had become a Christian, this was really, I was not expecting this. I had always considered universalism, the idea that everyone's going to heaven, that had always seemed heretical to me. I mean, certainly didn't seem biblical. And what little exposure I had to literature from universalists proved itself not to be biblical. But the way this thought came to me in the context of meditating on all these scriptures, it was like I knew the source was God. I knew as well as you could know. And I remembered back to when I had prayed the sinner's prayer, had become saved, had become born again, had become a Christian. And I remember believing that in 1978, that yes, that would make the difference between me going to heaven or hell. That's the way I was taught. And after that, I remember going through a very difficult period of several months after I had accepted Jesus, but my wife had not. In fact, she thought, what has happened to my husband? He's become a religious weirdo. And so there was a great deal of tension between she and I over this. And we were not used to that in our relationship. And, for my part, my biggest concern for her was, well, she's going to hell now. And until she accepts Jesus, she's going to hell. So, I felt good about me going to heaven, but I felt terrible about her going to hell. So it was a very, very rough four months. And I remember talking to another Christian. Someone had sort of coached me and counseled me in my initial Christian walk. And I was 28 years old and had been married about 8 years. And I remember talking to him about it, asking, what do I do? And I'm praying. And I remember breaking down crying. I was sobbing. This is how upset I was about her going to hell. So I definitely was one of these people who accepted the traditional evangelical teaching of, if you accept Jesus, you're going to heaven, and if you don't, you're going to hell. But like so many other evangelical Christians, I kind of, wandered away from that. It's not so much I wandered away from a conviction about it, but you just don't think about it. You don't concentrate on it. If you did, it would just affect your thinking all the time. And so while I continued to believe it, I didn't preach about it. I didn't preach on hell. I didn't warn people, okay, if you don't accept Jesus, you're going to hell. I just didn't. I never was drawn to that. I never felt when I studied the scriptures that I was drawn to that. Now I realize why, but then I just accepted that I was drawn where I was drawn to the subjects I was drawn to, and that was not one of them. So when this thought came to me that everyone was going to heaven, the first thing I felt, or the overriding thing I felt through all of it, was just this enormous sense of peace. And I was so grateful that everyone was going to heaven, so that deep concern that I had about my wife, which it got resolved back in 1978, because within a matter of a few months, she did accept Jesus. And so that ceased to be an issue then. But now I didn't have to worry about everybody else. And that meant my mom and dad, who had never accepted Jesus. That meant they were going to heaven. It meant my brothers, who had not accepted Jesus. In fact, there had been a great deal of tension in my family in 1978 when I had become a Christian, because I wanted all of them to become Christians, and they thought I had lost my mind. And they were Catholic, and of course, except for my mother, they didn't go to church regularly. So their Catholicism only arose when my evangelicalism arose. But I was so relieved, and I was so thankful. But at the same time, I didn't know what to do with this knowledge or this information. I didn't doubt it, but I didn't know what to do with it. So what happened over a course of days and weeks, though, you get caught up in the worries of the world and getting an income for your family, and after a while you're like, was that really God I heard? I mean, yeah, I'm sure it was, but what do I do with that? And you've got to preach this Sunday. Well, I can't preach on this. I don't have, I just didn't know what to do. And so what happened was, gradually over a period of time, I just lost the conviction about it and didn't think about it, except from time to time it would come back in my mind, and I'd like, yeah, I got to get back to that. But you just get caught up in everyday things. I'm not proud of that. I'm not justifying that. I'm not excusing that. It's not good. But you just get caught up in things. I eventually became the pastor of that church and went through that, and then became the pastor of a church that my wife and I started, a non-denominational church. So fast forward from 1982 to about 1993. This is like 10 years later. And I had been through so many, excuse me, I'm checking the time. I've got to bring this to a close. So maybe I'll just make this a two-parter and bring this to close in a minute and then finish it next week. But in 1993, I had been in ministry now for 12 years, and I had been pastoring a church I had started for 8 years. And when you're pastoring a church, you go through a lot of ups and downs. I don't know what it's like for denominational pastors. I do a little bit because I've talked to denominational pastors, but I ran in circles with non-denominational pastors. And there were lots of us in St. Louis, lots and lots of us. We used to have pastors' prayer meetings, and I used to go out of my way to make sure that I connected with other pastors, because I wanted to talk about the things that I was learning, and I wanted to be, I wanted to learn from them, and I wanted to feel connected. I didn't want to be off on my own like I was some kind of Lone Ranger pastor. And I particularly felt that way because I was a non-denominational pastor, because I didn't feel like, okay, well, I don't need anybody else. I felt like I needed the body of Christ. I needed connection with other people. And I had we've been through a lot of ups and downs as a church, and all my pastor friends had as well. We all went through these same things. And so the questions that haunted us are always the same thing. How do you grow a church? How do you keep it going? Because in a non-denominational church, it's usually the pastor where all the responsibility falls to make sure the bills get paid and the church is successful and is viable. And maybe that's a good place to stop. We've gone about 15 minutes, and I've got issues with how long the video is and getting it to upload and different things. So I apologize for burdening you with all that detail, but there's reasons why I got to keep the links to certain things. But next week I'll finish it off. Who knows, this might be a 3-parter. But I guess the main point for you that I would want to convey for this today is that God can speak into our lives, can speak wonderful things, but just through the mundane, daily worries and anxieties and fears and all those things, it can be taken away. You can lose something wonderful. And when I look back over those years, I think I could have done so much better for the Lord. I could have been so much more faithful had I been more faithful. Had I, like Peter said, cast all my anxiety upon Him, because He cares for me. Like Paul said, be anxious for nothing. Like John said, perfect love casts out fear. And like Jesus said, don't worry about the worries of the world. Don't focus on them. Each day has enough trouble of its own. But I didn't, and I lost my grasp on something wonderful that God was giving me. And next week I'll talk about how I regained it, how He gave it back to me, and the goodness that came from that. So thank you for listening. Everyone is going to heaven. Jesus Christ is Lord. Let's obey Him and honor Him. God bless you.